Mara Ellison had a talent for making bad first impressions look unforgettable. By 9:12 on her first morning at Halcyon Group, she had tripped over a polished steel threshold, sent a stack of black folders sliding across the lobby like cards in a magician's hand, and nearly collided with the one man in the building everyone spoke about in lowered voices. Adrian Vale, founder and chief executive officer, stood in the center of the marble floor with a tablet in one hand and a kind of stillness that made everyone else seem clumsy by comparison. Mara had seen his photographs in the company briefing packet the recruiter sent her, but those pictures had not prepared her for the reality of him. He was taller than she expected, sharper in person, his dark suit severe enough to look deliberate rather than fashionable, his expression unreadable in a way that instantly made her feel as if she had failed a test no one had told her she was taking. One of her folders hit the toe of his shoe and flipped open. Papers fanned across the floor. The silence in the lobby became so sudden it almost rang. "I am so sorry," Mara blurted, dropping to her knees before the last page stopped moving. "I swear I'm usually only this graceful in private." No one laughed. Not the receptionist. Not the security guard. Certainly not Adrian Vale. He looked down at her with a gaze that skimmed past embarrassment and landed somewhere far more dangerous, in that cool territory where judgment lived. Mara grabbed the scattered pages with fingers that had gone hot and numb at the same time. She could feel her cheeks burning. She had taken this job because her father's surgery had swallowed the savings she spent 6 years building, because rent was due in 12 days, because temporary work at one of the most powerful companies in the city seemed like the kind of miracle you did not insult by saying no. What she had not planned for was starting it sprawled on a marble floor like a cautionary tale. A hand appeared in front of her, long fingers, strong wrist, cuff immaculate. She blinked up. For one absurd moment she thought Adrian Vale was helping her. Then she realized he was holding a page she had missed. "You dropped this," he said. His voice was low, precise, and colder than the air coming from the lobby vents. Mara stood too quickly, nearly lost her balance again, caught herself, and snatched the paper. "Thank you." He glanced at the bright orange sticker on her folder. Executive office. Temporary assignment. Her stomach sank. Of all the people in the building to crash into, why did it have to be the man whose office she was apparently covering for while his longtime assistant was on leave? His gaze returned to her face. "You're late." She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "I'm actually 8 minutes early." A flicker crossed his expression. Not surprise. Not amusement. Something smaller and somehow worse, as if he disliked being contradicted and had filed the offense away for later. The executive office runs ahead of time. See that it remains that way. Then he stepped around her and walked toward the private elevators, leaving a wake of perfume-free authority and a lobby full of witnesses trying not to stare. Mara exhaled slowly. "Great," she muttered to herself. "Perfect. Wonderful start." By 9:30, she had learned 3 things. First, the executive floor was so quiet it made ordinary movement feel illegal. Second, Adrian Vale's schedule was run with military precision by a woman named Lynn, the operations director, who had kind eyes and an unforgiving calendar. Third, Adrian himself noticed everything. He noticed that Mara arranged his correspondence by urgency instead of alphabetically. He noticed she had set his 10 o'clock call in conference 2 when he preferred conference 1 for investor meetings because the acoustics were better. He noticed she reached for the coffee pot with her left hand and signed forms with her right. He noticed, most humiliatingly, when she nearly knocked over a floor lamp while backing away from his desk after handing him a contract. "Do you make a habit of fighting the furniture?" he asked without looking up, "or is today a special occasion?" The question should have sounded playful from anyone else. From him it sounded like a ruling. Mara gripped the lamp before it toppled. "I like to keep the office alert." His mouth shifted, only slightly, but enough that she noticed. Not a smile. More like the memory of one that had changed its mind. The rest of the morning did not improve. She misread a color-coded itinerary. She sent a courier to the wrong loading dock. She printed a 70-page report double-sided when Adrian wanted single sheets for annotation. Every correction he delivered was controlled, clipped, and devastatingly calm. He never raised his voice. He did not need to. He had perfected the kind of restraint that made every word feel more final. By noon Mara was certain he regretted her existence on a professional level. And yet, when she came back from the break room balancing tea she did not have time to drink and a stack of revised briefing packets, she found a fresh anti-slip mat under the lamp she had almost toppled. She paused. Lynn passed by and smiled faintly. Good idea, wasn't it? I didn't ask for one. No, Lynn said, glancing toward Adrian's office. You didn't. Mara looked through the glass wall. Adrian stood with his back to the room, one hand in his pocket, the city spread beneath him in sheets of silver light. He did not turn around. He did not acknowledge the mat. But something uneasy moved through her all the same. By late afternoon, the office had stopped feeling like a workplace and started feeling like a machine she was trying desperately not to jam. Adrian's meetings piled into one another. 2 board members arrived early. A supplier called about a delay that threatened to wreck a launch announcement scheduled for Friday. Then the legal team requested revised signatures on a merger packet Adrian needed before 6. Mara moved faster, steadier now, because panic had burned itself into concentration. She caught a typo in the supplier memo before it reached the board. She redirected a call from the press. She found the missing draft no one else could locate because the file had been saved under the interim title instead of the final one. When she placed the corrected packet on Adrian's desk, he scanned it once, then looked up. Who fixed section 4? Mara swallowed. I did. You spotted the discrepancy? Yes. A pause. The kind that could ruin a person. Then he said, good. One word. Barely softened. But it landed in her chest with ridiculous force. Mara hated that it mattered. Hated that his approval, given so sparingly, felt brighter than it should. She gave a quick nod and stepped back before he could see the foolish satisfaction on her face. At 6:20, the office finally emptied. Lynn had gone downstairs. The board members were gone. The city outside the windows had turned blue and gold. Mara sat alone at her borrowed desk, rubbing one foot against the back of her ankle, trying to decide whether she had survived the day or merely delayed disaster until tomorrow. Her inbox chimed. A calendar update appeared. Breakfast meeting, 7:30, moved to 8. Notes attached. Coffee preference included. She frowned. She had not entered the coffee preference. A second message arrived from Adrian, only 2 words long. Do not trip. Mara stared at the screen. Then, despite herself, she laughed. It slipped out before she could stop it, small and startled in the quiet office. Across the glass wall, Adrian remained at his desk, head bent over a file, expression unreadable. But she could not shake the strange sensation that he had timed the message to hear that exact sound. She gathered her bag and headed for the elevator, determined not to think about him all night. She failed before she reached the lobby. The second morning began with rain, a broken umbrella, and Mara arriving at the executive floor with damp curls escaping the knot at the base of her neck. She had changed shoes in the lobby restroom after stepping ankle-deep into a gutter, and she was still muttering under her breath about the universe when the private elevator doors opened and Adrian stepped out. He took one look at her, at the ruined umbrella dripping onto the polished floor, at the paper cup of coffee she was trying not to crush in her grip, and said, "You appear to have lost a disagreement with the weather. That implies the weather argued fairly." He glanced at the cup. "And yet you still brought coffee." Mara lifted it a little. "For me, yes. I've learned my lesson about arriving undercaffeinated in this office." He walked past her toward his door. "You'll need a replacement umbrella." "I have one. It is bent in 3 places." She stared after him. That sounds judgmental for someone who has never met my umbrella. He did not answer, but 10 minutes later a delivery assistant appeared with a long black package and her name written across the label in neat block letters. Inside was a new umbrella, sturdy and elegant and certainly more expensive than anything she would ever have bought for herself. There was no note. There did not need to be one. Lynn, who saw Mara standing with the open package and a confused expression, merely said, "He dislikes preventable inefficiency." Rain is inefficient. Wet assistants are. Mara looked at Adrian's closed office door and felt that same disorienting shift inside her. He was still impossible. Still severe. Still so controlled he seemed made from colder material than the rest of the world. But he kept leaving behind evidence that did not fit the version of him she was trying hard to believe. That would have been easier if he ever said anything kind out loud. Instead, he spent the morning cutting through mistakes with laser precision and asking questions that made her feel as though he expected excellence before she had even found her footing. At 11, a scheduling error put two important meetings within 15 minutes of one another. Mara saw it before anyone else. Adrian was on a call. Lynn was downstairs. The chief financial officer was already on his way up. Mara did the only thing she could. She called the investor, apologized, blamed a transport delay that sounded both plausible and vague, moved the meeting by 20 minutes, and rerouted the CFO to the smaller conference room with revised briefing materials. By the time Adrian ended his call, the crisis had been contained so smoothly it almost looked intentional. He studied the updated calendar. Who changed this? I did. You should have informed me before confirming with the investor. There wasn't time. His eyes lifted to hers. There is always time to communicate. Heat rushed into Mara's face. Of course. Of course, even fixing a problem became another item on her growing list of professional failures. I was trying to prevent you from walking into a collision. And instead you made a judgment call on my behalf. I made a judgment call to protect your morning. The words came out sharper than she intended. Silence followed, taut and immediate. Mara wished she could drag them back. No one spoke to Adrian Vale like that. Certainly not the temporary assistant who still checked corners before backing away from furniture. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Next time, inform me while you act." It took a second for the meaning to register. Not no. Not don't do it again. Just do it differently. Mara nodded. Understood. He returned to the schedule. The investor accepted. Yes. The CFO. In conference B with the corrected acquisition notes. A pause. Good. There it was again, that one word she should have stopped caring about. She turned away before it could show on her face. By afternoon the rain had darkened the windows and washed the city into blurred lights. Mara was carrying a stack of presentation folders to the archive room when one of the junior executives rounded a corner too fast, clipped her shoulder, and kept going without so much as an apology. The folders burst from her hands. Pages scattered over the carpet. Mara closed her eyes. Fantastic. When she opened them, Adrian was kneeling beside the mess, gathering papers into a neat stack with the swift efficiency he brought to everything. She had not even heard him approach. "You don't have to," she said, dropping down across from him. "You're obstructing the hallway." That almost sounded noble. It was practical. His fingers paused on a page. "You organized these by division. That seemed easier." "It is." She reached for the final sheet at the same moment he did. Their hands brushed. Not barely. Not accidentally enough to ignore. His skin was warm, his touch startlingly steady, and for a heartbeat the air between them changed. Mara looked up. Adrian was already looking at her. The hallway felt too narrow, the silence too close. Then he withdrew his hand and stood in one smooth motion. "Use the archive cart next time." "Right. Of course." Back to instructions. Back to control. Mara gathered the rest of the stack, annoyed with herself for the absurd leap her pulse had taken. Men like Adrian Vale did not look at women like that. Or if they did, it was probably because they were calculating risk. That evening, she left after everyone else except him. The rain had stopped, but the sidewalk still gleamed. When she stepped outside, she found a black town car idling at the curb. She frowned. The driver opened the rear door. There must be a mistake. No mistake, Ms. Ellison. Mr. Vale requested I take you home. Her first response was suspicion. Her second was irritation, because suspicion was safer than the tiny, dangerous pulse of warmth she did not want. She leaned down toward the open back window. Adrian sat inside, jacket off, tie loosened by half an inch, the city lights moving over his profile. He looked up from the file on his lap. "You're heading east," he said. "The train line is delayed due to flooding." "How do you know where I live?" "I know where all executive staff live in the event of emergency contact." That sounds normal in a very alarming way. His expression did not change. "Get in, Mara." The way he said her name made something shift deep inside her. Not softer. Not tender. But more personal than anything else he had given her. She got in because the train line really was delayed, because she was tired, because refusing would somehow feel more intimate than accepting. They rode in silence for several blocks. Mara kept her hands folded in her lap and watched the city slide by in silver reflections. Finally she said, "Thank you." "For the car or the umbrella?" She turned to look at him. "So you admit it was you?" "I admit nothing. But you know what I'm thanking you for." He closed the file. "You are an employee whose efficiency affects my schedule." Mara looked away before the sting could show. There it was. The cold logic behind every strange kindness. She had almost let herself believe there might be something human beneath it, something warmer than efficiency and control. When the car stopped outside her building, she reached for the handle. Adrian's voice stopped her. "You did well today." She froze. He was looking straight ahead, not at her. The scheduling decision was correct. The communication was not. Mara swallowed. "I'll improve." "I know." 2 words. Quiet. Certain. And somehow those words followed her all the way upstairs, where she stood alone in her tiny kitchen, drenched not in rain this time but in the unsettling realization that the man who seemed determined to dismantle her composure piece by piece was also the first person in months who sounded as though he expected her to become something more than tired. By the end of the second week, Mara understood the rhythm of the executive floor well enough to stop treating it like enemy territory. She learned when Adrian preferred silence and when silence meant he was already angry. She learned that he read every briefing packet twice, annotated with a fountain pen, and detested flimsy paper clips because they bent under pressure. She learned that his coffee went untouched whenever he was deeply focused and that, on those mornings, a glass of cold water placed at the right edge of his desk would actually disappear. More dangerously, she learned the shapes of his restraint. How his jaw tightened when investors wasted time. How his shoulders loosened a fraction when she entered his office with the exact file he wanted before he asked for it. How his gaze, no matter where a room began, eventually found her. She tried not to notice that last part. Failed often. The company was preparing for the launch of a community redevelopment initiative, one Adrian had personally funded after years of public speculation that he cared only about profit and scale. The project meant press coverage, donors, city officials, and a Friday night event at the renovated Harbor Glass Conservatory. For 3 straight days the office swelled with meetings, calls, floral samples, security revisions, transport maps, and seating arrangements capable of starting wars. Mara moved through it all with a sharpened kind of focus she had not realized she possessed until Adrian began relying on it. He still corrected her. Still delivered every comment as if he expected the room to obey before he finished speaking. But he no longer watched her like a potential liability. He watched her like someone measuring how far she could go if she stopped underestimating herself. Unfortunately, Mara remained excellent at creating fresh opportunities for humiliation. On Thursday afternoon she was carrying garment bags from the stylist's delivery room to the conference suite when the zipper on one split open. A deep blue evening dress slipped free, its silk pooling across the floor just as two members of the board rounded the corner. Mara bent to rescue it, caught her heel on the garment bag, and would have gone down hard if a hand had not closed around her elbow with firm, decisive strength. Adrian steadied her before the first gasp had fully formed. For a heartbeat she was suspended between disaster and recovery, one hand clutching the dress, the other braced lightly against his chest. His suit jacket was warm beneath her palm. His expression gave nothing away, but his grip remained on her arm long enough to make the moment feel less accidental than it should have. "You are," he said quietly, waging an impressive campaign against gravity. The board members laughed in relieved little bursts, happy to take their cue from him. Mara straightened, mortified. Gravity started it. A faint sound came from one of the older directors. Not quite a cough. Not quite concealed amusement. Adrian released her, bent, and lifted the fallen dress himself. He handed it back without so much as glancing at the fabric. "Conference suite," he said to the board, then turned to Mara. "My office. Now." Her stomach dropped. Of course. Public rescue followed by private execution. She followed him down the corridor with the garment bags digging into her fingers and humiliation tightening her throat. Once inside his office, she set everything carefully on the sofa and braced herself. Adrian closed the door. "Are you hurt?" She blinked. "What?" "Your ankle. You twisted when the heel caught." That was not the speech she had prepared for. "I'm fine." He looked unconvinced. "Sit." "It's really not." "Mara." Something in his tone made refusal impossible. She sat on the edge of the sofa. Adrian crouched in front of her before she could process what was happening. He did not touch her immediately. He just looked at the strap of her shoe, then at her face, as if asking permission in the only language he trusted. Mara's breath caught. She nodded once. He unfastened the strap and slid the shoe from her foot with careful efficiency. His fingers brushed her skin. Heat shot through her so fast she almost pulled away on instinct. He rested one hand lightly at her ankle, examining the slight redness already rising there. "It's not swollen," he said. "It's embarrassing that you know that." "I know many things." "That is not comforting." His mouth moved again, that almost smile that never fully committed itself. "No. I imagine it isn't." He set her shoe beside him and stood. The movement broke the strange intimacy as quickly as a snapped thread. Mara looked down at her bare foot on the carpet and wished her pulse would return to normal. He crossed to his desk, opened a drawer, and returned with a slim medical cold pack. "Keep that on it for 10 minutes. You keep cold packs in your office?" "I prefer preparation to regret." She took the pack from him. "Is this where you tell me the event requires assistants who can remain upright? If it did, you would have been dismissed on your first day." The answer was so dry, so unexpected, that Mara laughed before she could stop herself. Adrian looked at her then, fully, and the room turned unsteady in a different way. It was not simply that he was handsome. She had known that from the beginning. It was the intensity with which he seemed to register her laughter, as though it had caught him off guard and he resented being caught by anything at all. "Wear flats until the event begins," he said. "Yes, sir." His eyes narrowed a fraction. "Don't call me that." Mara lifted one brow. "You seem like a man who collects titles." "I prefer accuracy." "And Adrian isn't accurate?" He held her gaze for a second too long. "Not in the office." She looked away first. "Safer that way." That night the final event checklist ran past 8. Catering confirmed. Security confirmed. Press schedule confirmed. Donor seating confirmed. Mara was compiling emergency contact sheets when a woman swept into the executive floor without waiting to be announced. Tall, elegant, silver dress under a winter white coat, she carried herself with the easy entitlement of someone used to being let through every door. Adrian still works ridiculous hours, she said to no one in particular. Mara stood. Can I help you? The woman's gaze moved over her with polished indifference. I'm Celeste Arden. He's expecting me. Mara checked the calendar. No Celeste. No private meeting. No dinner. I'm sorry. I don't have that listed. Celeste smiled the kind of smile women in expensive magazines practiced. He'll see me. She started toward Adrian's office just as the door opened from inside. Adrian looked from Celeste to Mara and then, in one cool sweep, took in the entire situation. Celeste, he said. This is unannounced. Celeste lifted one shoulder. That has never bothered you before. Mara stepped back, suddenly very interested in the contact sheets on her desk. Something sharp and unpleasant slid beneath her ribs. She told herself it was second-hand discomfort. Nothing else. Adrian's voice remained steady. I'm occupied. Celeste finally looked at Mara as if acknowledging that the furniture had a face. Clearly. A colder silence followed. Mara did not look up, but she felt it change. When Adrian spoke again, each word was cut from clean steel. Ms. Ellison is part of my staff. Speak respectfully or leave. Mara's head jerked up. Celeste's expression tightened by a degree. Of course, Celeste said. I didn't realize the office had become so personal. It has not, Adrian said. The strange hope that had flared in Mara's chest went out instantly. Of course it had not. Why would it? She gathered the completed contact sheets before anyone could see her face. Celeste left 2 minutes later, all cool perfume and clipped heels. Adrian remained by his office door, expression unreadable. Mara avoided his eyes. Your car is here, he said. She nodded. I'm leaving. As she moved past him, he said her name. She stopped. Tomorrow will be difficult. Don't let unnecessary distractions interfere with your work. It was probably meant about Celeste. Probably. But fatigue and jealousy and humiliation twisted it into something harsher before it reached her. Don't get ideas. Don't misunderstand. Don't mistake brief moments of attention for meaning. Mara gave him a tight smile she did not feel. You don't have to worry about that. She walked away before he could answer, unaware that behind her Adrian remained motionless in the center of the office, watching her go with the expression of a man who had made a small mistake and understood, too late, that it would cost more than it should. The harbor glass conservatory glittered like a lantern against the river, every panel of restored glass catching the city lights and throwing them back in fractured gold. By 7 o'clock the place was filled with donors, council members, reporters, and enough expensive perfume to make the air feel upholstered. Mara wore the blue dress the stylist had delivered, though she had spent 20 minutes in her apartment considering whether it was too much and another 10 wondering why she cared. Her ankle was fine in the silver flats she hid beneath the hem. Her hair, impossible most days, had surrendered to the stylist's hands and now fell in soft waves over one shoulder. She looked like a version of herself built for a brighter life, and that made her feel strangely unsteady. The first time Adrian saw her that evening, he stopped walking. Not noticeably enough for anyone else, probably. But Mara noticed. She was standing near the registration table checking guest placements when his reflection appeared in the glass beyond her, dark suit, white shirt, black tie, all hard lines and controlled elegance. Then the reflection stilled. She turned. His eyes moved over her once, slowly, not careless and not kind. Something unreadable passed through them, swift and hot enough to make her skin prickle. By the time he reached her side, his expression was once again composed. "Table 8 is missing one donor card," she said because it was safer than silence. "Then replace it." "I already did." "A beat." "Of course you did," he said. Then he moved on, leaving Mara with a pulse that had forgotten every professional lesson she had learned in the past 2 weeks. The event began smoothly. Speeches ran on time. The multimedia presentation worked. The mayor arrived only 6 minutes late, which Lynn whispered counted as miraculous. Mara floated between the registration desk, the donor tables, the backstage queue point, and the side corridor where the press coordinator kept losing her microphone packs. Every time she looked up, Adrian seemed to be somewhere nearby. Talking to a city official. Greeting a philanthropist. Listening to a council member with focused patience. And always, when no one else was looking, noticing where Mara was. She told herself it meant nothing. Men like Adrian Vale did not ache. They assessed. They monitored. They controlled outcomes. If his attention lingered on her, it was probably because she represented potential chaos in expensive shoes. Halfway through dinner, Celeste arrived. She did not simply enter the room. She appeared in it, silver silk and strategic timing, as if she had studied the floor plan and chosen the exact moment Adrian would be visible from across the conservatory. Mara was standing at the edge of the main aisle adjusting a place card when Celeste crossed directly toward him with the confidence of someone who expected the room to rearrange itself. Adrian's expression did not warm. Celeste touched his sleeve. "You ignored my calls." "I was working." "So am I, socially." The people nearest them laughed too quickly. Mara looked away, but not before she saw Celeste's fingers slide from Adrian's sleeve to his wrist, intimate in a way that turned Mara's stomach sharp with a feeling she refused to name. "Ms. Ellison," Adrian said. She looked up. He was already watching her. "Join us." That was the last thing she wanted. Exactly because she wanted it. But there was no room to refuse. She stepped forward, every instinct demanding caution. Celeste's smile hardened by one polished degree. "Your assistant." "Ms. Ellison coordinates the executive office," Adrian said. "And tonight she is the reason this event has remained functional." The words hit harder than they should have. Praise from him in public felt almost indecent, like a private door opening where no door should exist. Celeste let her gaze drift over Mara's dress, her hair, the flats hidden under silk. "Then I suppose we are all grateful." Mara smiled back, equally polished. Efficiency is a team effort. If Celeste heard the echo of Adrian's favorite excuse, she gave no sign. But Adrian did. Mara saw it in the quick, impossible to miss shift at the corner of his mouth. The photographer arrived at that exact moment and asked for a few executive shots. Adrian turned, naturally, toward the sponsor wall. Celeste moved with him. So did 2 donors. Then the photographer, noting Mara beside the registration stand, brightened. "You too. Closer." Mara froze. "Oh, that's not necessary." "It is," Adrian said. Before she could object, he placed one hand lightly at the small of her back and guided her into position beside him. The touch lasted no more than a second. It burned for much longer. Cameras flashed. Celeste's expression became a work of art in restraint. Mara focused on not breathing too obviously. When the photographer finally stepped away, Adrian's hand was gone, but the memory of it stayed like an imprint under her skin. "You didn't need to do that," she said under her breath once the others moved off. "Yes, I did." "Why?" His eyes met hers. In the noise of the conservatory, with voices rising and glasses clinking and the river sliding black outside the glass walls, his answer came very softly. "Because I was asked." That was not a reason. It was a shield. Mara recognized one when she heard it. Whatever had flickered between them vanished under the old, familiar cold. She stepped back first. Later, near the end of the evening, a donor's child darted through the side aisle and nearly pulled a cable from the lighting rig. Mara caught the loose cord just in time, but in doing so spilled a full tray of sparkling water across the floor at the edge of the stage steps. 2 waiters rushed forward. The mother apologized. Mara crouched to help. And there he was again. Adrian took the towels from a waiter, handed one to Mara, and knelt beside her in front of half the city. Reporters. Donors. Politicians. He did not care who saw him wiping water from the floor next to the assistant everyone assumed was temporary and forgettable. "You'll stain your suit," Mara whispered. "Then work faster." It should have annoyed her. Instead it made her want to laugh and cry in the same breath. They finished in under a minute. He rose first and held out his hand. This time, when she took it, he closed his fingers around hers fully, pulling her up in one smooth motion. The contact was entirely practical. Entirely professional. Entirely too much. When the final guests began to leave, Lynn intercepted Mara near the service corridor. "Mr. Vale wants the revised donor packet in the car." "Tonight?" "Apparently." Mara should have expected it. She changed out of her event shoes, bundled the packet, and headed for the private pickup entrance. Adrian was already there, speaking with a security officer. The air outside had turned cold. Her breath ghosted white. He took the packet from her. "Thank you." She nodded. "Anything else?" He looked at her bare ankles, then at the thin coat she had thrown over her dress. "Where is your proper coat?" "This is my proper coat." A dark line formed between his brows. He shrugged out of his own overcoat and held it toward her. "No. That was not a question. I'm not wearing your coat. You are freezing. I'm managing." The security officer abruptly discovered a fascinating reason to move 10 feet away. Adrian stepped closer. "Mara." The way he said her name was different again. Lower. Tighter. Almost angry, but not with her. She took the coat because refusing suddenly felt childish. It was heavy and warm and carried the faint scent of cedar and clean night air. Adrian watched her settle it over her shoulders with an intensity that made her chest ache. Then Celeste appeared at the curb in a pool of headlights, and the moment shattered. "Adrian," she called. "Are we still having this discussion, or have you found a more interesting distraction?" Mara went still. Adrian did not turn around immediately, which somehow made it worse. She handed him the empty packet folder and forced a smile. "Good night, Mr. Vale." He looked back at her. "Keep the coat." She heard the order beneath the words. Heard, too, the concern he would never phrase plainly. But Celeste was already standing 3 yards away, and whatever fragile illusion the evening had built broke under the simple cruelty of reality. Men like Adrian kept beautiful women waiting in headlights and lent coats to employees out of habit, not hunger. Mara stepped back. "I'll return it tomorrow." Along with the distraction. The next morning Mara arrived early enough to return the coat before the executive floor woke up, but Adrian was already there. Of course he was. He stood at the windows with the city still pale behind him, jacket off, cuffs rolled, a phone pressed to one ear. He ended the call as she stepped inside. "You left before I could explain," he said. Mara set the folded coat on the chair opposite his desk. "You don't owe me an explanation. Don't decide what I owe." The answer was sharp enough to stop her. She lifted her chin. "Fine. Then I don't need one." For a second, neither of them moved. The office seemed too quiet, the distance between them too exact. Adrian crossed to the desk and set down his phone. Celeste was there to discuss a property acquisition. Mara gave a tiny nod she did not feel. "That sounds thrilling." "She is not my concern." The sentence reached her half a second too late, which was enough time for it to do damage. "Not my concern." Not important. Not relevant. Or perhaps not yours to question. Mara looked away before her face could betray how much that distinction hurt. Understood. He studied her. No, you clearly do not. Something in her snapped, not loudly, but cleanly. She was tired of being corrected, tired of trying to decode every look, tired of feeling foolish for noticing the spaces where his actions contradicted his words. You're right, she said. I don't understand why you send cars and umbrellas and coats and then speak to me like I'm a scheduling problem with shoes. I don't understand why you notice everything about me only to remind me I'm part of your staff whenever someone else enters the room. And I definitely don't understand why that should matter. The last sentence escaped before she could stop it. Silence followed, huge and immediate. Adrian's expression changed, but only slightly. That made it worse. If he had looked angry, she could have fought anger. What she saw instead was concentration so intense it almost hurt to meet. Mara. Please don't, she said, backing toward the door. I am very aware of where I stand in this building. You don't have to clarify it again. She left before he could answer. The minute the door closed behind her, her composure broke into sharp, humiliating pieces. She did not cry. She refused that particular defeat. But she worked through the morning with a controlled stiffness that felt worse. Lynn noticed immediately and said nothing, which was somehow kind. By noon the office was thrown into crisis. An anonymous message had been sent to several local journalists claiming Halcyon had manipulated displacement figures in the redevelopment project to make the community response appear more favorable. The accusation was false, but the timing was catastrophic. Reporters started calling within minutes. The legal department flooded the executive floor. 2 board members demanded an emergency briefing. Adrian disappeared into conference rooms with the communications chief and the head of legal, emerging only long enough to issue orders so concise they felt like commands on a battlefield. Mara should have been grateful for the distraction. Instead she found herself moving through the chaos with painful awareness of him. His clipped tone. The fatigue he hid under discipline. The way he rubbed 2 fingers against his temple when reading the allegation packet. This, she realized with sudden clarity, was where his coldness came from. Not a lack of feeling. An excess of responsibility. He lived in a permanent state of containment because too many people were always waiting to use his smallest weakness against him. That understanding should have softened her. Instead it made her angrier, because it meant he knew exactly what distance cost and chose it anyway. At 3:15, the communications chief asked for the original community data summaries used in the grant submission. Legal needed them immediately. No one could find the archived annotated version. Mara knew why. She had seen a mislabeled backup folder during the event preparations, one filed under the district code instead of the project title. Without waiting to be asked twice, she ran to the secure records room, dug through the archive server, and found the entire packet exactly where she suspected it would be. When she brought it to the conference suite, the room fell silent. Adrian took the folder, scanned the cover sheet, and looked up at her. Where did you get this? District Archive Backup. It was mislabeled. The communications chief nearly sagged with relief. This proves the figures were documented before the grant review. Legal was already reaching for copies. Adrian kept his eyes on Mara for one more second. Stay. The others moved into action. Mara remained by the wall, unsure why he wanted her there until the board member leading the emergency response asked, how did no one else think to check that backup path? Mara started to answer, then hesitated. Adrian answered for her. Because no one else was paying attention the way she was. The room shifted. Heads turned. The communications chief gave Mara a new kind of look, no longer at the temporary assistant but at someone whose competence had just been vouched for by the most exacting man in the building. Heat rose into her face. The emergency statement went out 40 minutes later. The accusation began to collapse within the hour. By early evening the worst of the crisis had passed, but the office was left with the drained, brittle quiet of people who had been braced too long. Mara was gathering marked-up copies from the conference table when Adrian came in behind her and closed the door. "You should have let me finish this morning." She did not turn around. Would it have helped? Yes. Something in the certainty of his answer made her face him. He stood a few feet away, tie loosened, eyes darker with fatigue than she had ever seen them. For the first time since she had met him, he looked less like a force and more like a man holding too many walls upright at once. "You defended me in there," she said. "You earned it." "That isn't the same thing." "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." The room went very still. Then someone knocked on the glass, and the moment vanished again. Lynn entered with updated press notes. Adrian stepped back at once, expression sealed. Mara hated how much the retreat stung. As she passed his desk later on her way out, she noticed a small paper bag beside her keyboard. Inside was dinner from the deli downstairs, exactly the soup she had once mentioned liking when talking to Lynn. No note. No explanation. Just warmth in a paper cup and a sandwich wrapped with absurd care. Mara stood there too long, fingers tightening around the bag. He noticed what she ate. He noticed when she forgot to eat. He noticed everything. And still he never said the one thing she had started to fear he could not say at all. The rumor crisis should have cooled the office. Instead it sharpened everything. The board now knew Mara was useful. The legal team knew she was observant. Lynn had begun trusting her with tasks once reserved for permanent staff. Most dangerous of all, Adrian had stopped pretending not to depend on her. He asked for her directly now. He sent late-night schedule revisions to her inbox with no intermediary. He called her into strategy meetings and expected her memory to hold details others overlooked. Every sign pointed to increased trust. Unfortunately, trust was turning out to be far more intimate than simple kindness ever could have been. On Tuesday, 3 days after the conservatory event, Mara was in Adrian's office reviewing travel logistics for a site inspection outside the city when he stepped around his desk and leaned over her shoulder to read the tablet in her hand. He was close enough that his sleeve brushed her arm. Close enough that she could feel the heat of him before contact even happened. His aftershave was clean and spare, impossible to name and even harder to ignore. "The contractor list is missing one name," he said. "It isn't missing. I put the secondary contractor under the utilities tab because they're only on standby." His gaze shifted from the tablet to her profile. "You're right." Mara turned her head, intending to point out the note in the margin, and discovered how little space remained between them. For one suspended second she forgot what she meant to say. Adrian did not move away. His eyes dropped, just once, to her mouth. Not long. Not enough to be undeniable. But enough that the silence between them changed shape. Then his phone rang. He stepped back instantly, expression cooling as if the moment had never existed. Mara spent the next hour being furious with herself for reacting to it at all. The site inspection required a 2-hour drive to a former manufacturing district Halcyon planned to convert into mixed-income housing and public studio space. Lynn usually handled external logistics, but a supply chain issue had pulled her into another project, leaving Mara to accompany Adrian and the development team. She told herself the trip would be easy: schedules, notes, handoffs, car ride, return. Nothing about it should have felt personal. Yet when she slid into the back seat of the company car and found Adrian sitting beside her rather than across from her, the air changed at once. The development director took the front passenger seat, filling the ride with project timelines and zoning concerns. Mara focused on note-taking. Adrian answered questions in that low, unhurried voice that made everyone else compress their thoughts into cleaner shapes. Once, when the car hit an unexpected pothole, Mara jolted sideways. Adrian's hand closed around her forearm before she could collide with the door. He released her the moment she steadied, but the imprint of his grip lingered like a private injury. At the site itself, the old factory was all brick skeletons and dusty light. The roof over one annex had been removed, exposing beams to the pale afternoon sky. Mara moved carefully through the temporary walkways, tablet tucked against her chest. Adrian noticed when she hesitated near a loose metal threshold. "Stay to the right," he said. "The left side isn't anchored." "How do you know that?" "Because I pay attention." The answer should have been simple. It wasn't. Not when he kept directing those words toward her like they contained a second meaning neither of them was willing to touch. During the final walkthrough, one of the outside consultants made a joke about Mara acting more like a chief of staff than a temporary assistant. Adrian replied before she could. "She acts like someone I intend to keep." The consultant laughed. Mara did not. Her pulse had gone suddenly wild, but she refused to give it power. Intent to keep could mean permanent contract, nothing more. Probably did. Almost certainly did. Men like Adrian did not reveal themselves through offhand remarks at construction sites. On the ride back, the development director took a call and spent most of the journey murmuring into his headset, effectively disappearing from the conversation. The city lights began to gather in the distance. Mara looked out the window because looking at Adrian felt reckless. "You were quiet today," he said. "I was working." "You usually manage both." She glanced at him. "Is that criticism?" "It's observation." "That's often indistinguishable with you." Something like resignation crossed his face. "I know." The honesty of it startled her. She turned more fully toward him. "Do you?" "Yes." The car hummed on around them, the front seat still wrapped in muted conversation. Adrian rested one arm along the center console, fingers relaxed for once rather than tightly composed. "I am not good," he said slowly, as if each word had to be chosen under pressure, "at appearing anything other than demanding when something matters to me." Mara stared at him. "That is possibly the least encouraging explanation anyone has ever given." His mouth almost softened. "It is also true." The space between them seemed to narrow. Mara should have let the sentence sit. Should have protected herself with caution. Instead she asked the question that had lived under her ribs for days. "Why do I matter?" Adrian looked at her for so long she wondered if he would refuse to answer. Then the car turned onto a brighter avenue, city lights spilling across his face, and she saw the conflict there with devastating clarity. He wanted to say something. He did not say it. Finally he replied, "Because you alter the room when you enter it." Mara forgot how to breathe. Before she could form a response, the development director ended his call and began discussing budget contingencies with renewed energy. The moment snapped cleanly in half. Adrian turned his attention away with brutal efficiency. By the time they reached the office, he was once again every inch the executive the city feared and courted in equal measure. Mara spent the rest of the evening in a state of dangerous suspension. "Because you alter the room when you enter it." The words were not a confession. They were not even clear. But no one said things like that by accident. No one looked at a woman the way Adrian had looked at her in the car unless something inside him was already slipping. So naturally the universe corrected her optimism by placing Celeste in the lobby the next morning, smiling as if she had been invited. Mara stopped short. Celeste's gaze moved over her with cool assessment. "You must be getting very comfortable up there." Mara tightened her grip on the folders in her hands. "I'm working." "Of course. Adrian always likes having competent women nearby." The sentence carried too much history for comfort. Mara said nothing. Celeste stepped closer. "Just a little advice. Men like him do not choose softness. They choose usefulness. Don't mistake proximity for preference." The blow landed because part of Mara already feared it was true. She moved toward the private elevator without replying. The doors opened. Adrian stood inside. His gaze took in Mara's face, then Celeste's satisfied smile, and turned glacial. What was said? Nothing important, Mara answered too quickly. Celeste lifted a shoulder. I was only being honest. Adrian's expression hardened into something frighteningly calm. Leave. Celeste blinked. Adrian. Now. The elevator doors remained open while silence cracked through the lobby. Celeste's chin lifted. Then, with all the elegance of wounded vanity, she turned and walked away. Mara stepped into the elevator on shaking legs. Adrian hit the close button. The doors sealed them into mirrored quiet. What did she say? Mara stared at the numbers above the panel. That I shouldn't mistake usefulness for anything else. The silence that followed was so complete she could hear the machinery climbing. Then Adrian said, very softly, that was cruel. Not untrue. Not irrelevant. Cruel. Mara looked at him then and saw anger in his face for the first time. Not the abstract anger he brought to negotiations. Personal anger. Protective anger. It terrified her, because it also felt like hope. Hope, she was learning, was the most dangerous thing in the building. Adrian did not mention Celeste again that day, but the atmosphere on the executive floor changed in ways even the interns could feel. Meetings were shorter. Instructions sharper. Two vice presidents emerged from his office looking as if they had narrowly escaped a storm front. Mara should have kept her distance. Instead she found herself more attuned to him than ever, as though the elevator silence had pulled something hidden too close to the surface. He was angry on her behalf. That fact lived inside her all day, warm and impossible. By late afternoon the office had emptied into the uneasy hush that came after a hard week. Rain began again, whispering against the windows. Mara stayed to finish a revised staffing document because leaving felt too abrupt, too much like surrendering a thread she could not name. She was the only one outside Adrian's office when the power flickered once, twice, and then failed entirely. The entire executive floor dropped into darkness. For half a second there was only the rain and the low electronic sigh of systems switching to backup. Then emergency lights snapped on along the corridor, casting everything in dim amber. Mara startled at the sudden change and nearly knocked over the edge of her desk. From inside his office came Adrian's voice, immediate and steady. Mara. I'm fine. Don't move. That would have been less absurd if she had not already moved. She heard him crossing the room before she saw him. Then he was there in the doorway, tie gone, sleeves rolled, the emergency light sharpening every angle of his face. Facilities says the outage affects this side of the district, he said, phone in hand. Backup power will hold basic systems, but the elevators are out. Mara stared at the dark windows, where the city beyond looked suddenly vast and primitive. I hate that sentence. I know. Of course he knew. He knew too much. The backup generator powered only emergency strips and minimal network access, leaving the office transformed into something quieter and more intimate than it had any right to be. Adrian told the security team to send lanterns upstairs. Mara helped collect hard copies of key files in case the server stuttered. When the first lantern arrived, he set it on her desk rather than his own. I can see in the dark, he said when she noticed. That is both arrogant and mildly supernatural. It is practical. Sit. She sat because arguing in near darkness felt like flirting, and that was a line she was trying desperately not to cross. Adrian remained standing for a moment, looking down at her with that unreadable intensity that made every ordinary instruction feel loaded. Then he moved away to take another call. Hours might have passed. In reality it was less than 40 minutes before facilities announced the outage would take longer than expected. Most of the building had already been evacuated. Security advised the remaining executive staff to wait on their floors until the elevators reset or escorted stair descent could be arranged. There are 53 flights between here and the lobby, Mara said when Adrian relayed the message. Yes. I would like the record to show that I object. The record is noted. She should not have smiled. She did anyway. The storm outside worsened. Rain hammered the glass. Somewhere far below, a siren wailed. Adrian finally set down his phone and looked at her as if making a decision. "There's a break room 2 corridors over with emergency supplies," he said. "I want you to eat something. I'm not a child." "No. Children take better care of themselves when instructed." Mara rose, partly indignant, partly amused despite herself. "You are impossible. I am consistent." She headed toward the break room, lantern in hand. Adrian followed, which she told herself was because leaving staff alone in a dark building was a liability issue and not because he treated her every minor inconvenience like a problem that required personal supervision. The break room was lit by a single emergency strip and smelled faintly of stale coffee. Mara found packaged crackers and 2 bottles of water. "Luxury," she said. Adrian took 1 bottle and leaned against the counter across from her. For a minute they simply ate in the dim light, the storm pressing at the windows beyond. Then Mara, perhaps because darkness felt honest, said, "Why do you always tell me not to fall?" He looked at her. "Because you don't notice edges when you're thinking. You notice that? I notice when you bite the inside of your cheek while reading. I notice you alphabetize names under pressure even if the task does not require it. I notice you pretend not to be tired by becoming more sarcastic. I notice," he said more quietly, "far more than I should." The crackers in Mara's hand suddenly seemed unreal. She stared at him, heart striking once, hard enough to hurt. "Why?" The single word left no room for retreat. Adrian set his bottle down with careful precision. The storm filled the silence between them. "Because from the first morning," he said, "you have been the one thing in this building I could not treat as routine." Mara could not move. Could barely breathe. The dim emergency light made his face harder to read, but not his voice. His voice was the most honest thing she had ever heard from him. "You looked at me like you hated me," she whispered. His expression changed then, and it changed enough. Pain, frustration, something close to disbelief. "Mara, if I hated you, you would know." That is not comforting either. A rough sound escaped him, almost a laugh, almost despair. He pushed away from the counter and came 1 step closer. "No more. I watched you because you unsettled me," he said. "Because you made me aware of every room you stood in. Because I found myself rearranging details that should not have mattered to me. Cars. Umbrellas. Meals. Schedules. Because wanting to make your life easier became an instinct before I had decided what to do with it." Mara's pulse was so loud she barely heard the rain. "And because," he continued, voice lower now, "I knew that if I let any of that show too clearly, I would not stop at small things." Her throat tightened. "So you were cruel instead." "I was controlled." "That's not the same thing." "No," he said. "It isn't." The honesty of that nearly undid her. He was close enough now that she could see the tension in his jaw, the restraint he wore like another tailored layer. Mara should have stepped back. Should have demanded clarity, time, caution. Instead she asked the only question that mattered. "What would happen if you stopped being controlled?" Adrian looked at her with an expression so nakedly intent that the room seemed to contract around them. "I would kiss you," he said. The emergency light hummed. The storm raged. Mara felt the world tilt. Then his phone rang, sharp and bright in the dark. The spell shattered so violently it almost hurt. Adrian closed his eyes for half a second, answered the call, listened, and straightened. "Power restoration in 15 minutes, he said after ending it. "Security is resetting the elevators." Of course. Reality always arrived the moment things became unbearable. Mara placed the uneaten crackers on the counter. "Right." He said her name. She shook her head once. "Not because I don't want you to," she said quietly. "Because I do, and that's the problem." Then she walked out of the break room before he could see how badly her hands were trembling, carrying with her the impossible certainty that the man she had spent weeks believing cold now burned with a force even he could barely contain. After the power returned, the office snapped back into its usual polished shape so quickly it felt almost insulting. Screens glowed. Elevators resumed. Security sent cheerful updates as if the building had not just briefly transformed into a confession chamber. Mara gathered her things and went home without seeing Adrian again, though she knew, with the same strange certainty she had learned to distrust, that he watched her leave. She did not sleep much. Every time she closed her eyes she heard his voice in the dark. "I would kiss you. Not I might. Not I have considered it." The certainty of it had undone something in her. Because if he wanted her, truly wanted her, then every sharp word and controlled glance and inexplicable act of care had to be reinterpreted. Her humiliation. His distance. The endless cold she had mistaken for dislike. It all shifted under the new truth like a city map redrawn overnight. Which would have been wonderful if life were a romance and not a corporate structure full of consequences. By morning Mara had made a decision: she would keep things professional until he chose clarity in daylight. Not partial confessions in dim corridors. Not gestures that could be denied later. Real words. Real intent. Anything less would destroy her. This was a disciplined and intelligent plan for approximately 43 minutes. At 9:23, Halcyon's internal network was hit by a coordinated data breach attempt aimed at siphoning confidential acquisition files through a vendor access channel. The entire executive floor went into immediate lockdown. IT sealed server access. Legal requested document tracing. Adrian convened crisis leads in the main conference room. Mara, running on too little sleep and too much adrenaline, became the central point between departments by virtue of being the only person who could keep the message chain straight under pressure. The breach was not entirely successful, but it exposed something ugly. Someone with partial internal knowledge had timed the attempt to coincide with a vendor credential renewal. Suspicion fell quickly on an external consultant recently removed from the redevelopment project after clashing with Adrian over compliance controls. Unfortunately, that consultant had also spent enough time around the executive floor to observe staffing patterns, meaning the attack had likely been planned for days. By noon journalists had begun asking questions again. By 1, a board member demanded to know why Halcyon's internal safeguards had not identified the vendor pathway earlier. By 2, the head of IT needed archived access logs from a weekend Mara remembered because she had manually approved temporary visitor badges during the conservatory event. She found the discrepancy no one else had connected. One badge had been extended by 7 minutes beyond the approved time, allowing a consultant's assistant to remain on the executive floor after escort procedures ended. When she brought the finding into the crisis room, Adrian looked up from the head of the table with that same fierce concentration that made the rest of the world fade at the edges. "Explain," he said. Mara did. Clear, direct, precise. The room listened. When she finished, the chief information officer swore softly and started issuing orders. The legal chief called for badge footage. The board member who had dismissed her as temporary 3 weeks ago said, with visible reluctance, that may be the missing link. Adrian never took his eyes off her. It is. The breach was contained by late afternoon. Vendor access suspended. Press statement drafted. Internal review launched. The company would survive. But the strain of the day left everyone raw. Mara finally made it back to her desk close to 6, head pounding. She had not eaten since morning. She sat down too fast and pressed her fingers to her temple. A glass of water appeared beside her hand. She looked up. Adrian stood there, jacket off again, fatigue written in the hard line of his shoulders. "You're pale." "I'm fine." "No, you're obedient to habit." "That's different." A reluctant laugh escaped her. He took the chair opposite her desk without asking. The executive floor had nearly emptied. Rain-washed sunlight stretched low across the windows. "About last night," he said. Mara's pulse stumbled. "That's a large topic." "Yes." He looked, unexpectedly, as though he disliked uncertainty in this area even more than she did. Which made sense. Negotiations, numbers, mergers, hostile bids, those things obeyed systems. Feeling did not. "I do not intend," he said slowly, "to leave what I said in darkness and let you decide it was fatigue or circumstance." She said nothing. "I meant it." The room seemed to narrow around the words. "I know the position this creates," he continued. "I know your contract status, the power imbalance, the potential for pressure where there should be none. I know exactly why I should have remained silent." Mara held very still. "But?" His gaze sharpened. "But silence has not protected you. It has only allowed you to believe the wrong thing." That was so direct it hurt. She looked down at her desk because the alternative was to let him see too much. "You looked at me," she said quietly, "like I made your life harder." His answer came without delay. "You made it more difficult to pretend I was unaffected." Mara lifted her eyes. Adrian leaned back slightly, as though forcing himself not to move any closer. "I have wanted to touch you in moments when touching you would have been reckless. I have watched doors, stairs, schedules, meals, weather, because the idea of anything careless happening to you has become intolerable. And I have been angry more than once, not because you frustrated me, but because every time you walked away believing I disliked you, I knew I had built that misunderstanding myself." The honesty in his voice was devastating. Not polished. Not safe. Real. Mara's throat tightened. "What happens now?" "That depends on what you want." Simple words. Immense mercy. For once he was not deciding for her, not steering the room, not protecting himself with efficiency. He was offering choice. She looked at him for a long moment, this impossible man who had hidden concern inside orders and desire inside restraint until she had nearly broken trying to understand him. Then she stood. Adrian rose too, immediate as instinct. Mara walked around the desk until only a step remained between them. "I want you," she said, astonished at the steadiness of her own voice, "to stop speaking to me like I am one more item on your calendar." Something fierce and almost disbelieving crossed his face. "Done. And I want daylight honesty." "You have it." "And I want," she said, pulse roaring now, "to know whether you only say dangerous things in dark rooms." For the first time since she had met him, Adrian Vale smiled without reservation. It changed his entire face and nearly ruined her. "No," he said. "I am dangerous in any lighting." She laughed, breathless, and that was the moment the office door opened. Lynn stood on the threshold, took one look at the distance between them, and said with perfect serenity, "I will come back in 10 minutes. The door closed again. Mara stared at it. Adrian did not move. Then, very quietly, he said, "I'm starting to think the building itself objects to my timing." She turned back to him. "You and I finally agree on something." His hand lifted, hesitated inches from her waist, giving her one last chance to retreat. She stepped closer instead. The kiss was not gentle because neither of them had room left for gentleness at the start. It was controlled only in the sense that Adrian was clearly restraining far more than he allowed. One hand settled at the small of her back, firm and careful at once. Mara rose onto her toes and felt every rigid line of him soften into want. By the time they drew apart, the world outside the office seemed irrelevant. He rested his forehead briefly against hers. 10 minutes, he murmured. Mara smiled despite the racing of her heart. "You should probably use them to practice being normal." "I have no interest in normal." That, she thought as she touched his tie-less collar with trembling fingers, was the first completely uncomplicated thing he had ever said to her. Dating Adrian Vale in secret for 6 business days was enough to prove that power, intelligence, and self-control did not prevent a man from becoming unexpectedly obsessive once he stopped pretending. It simply changed the form obsession took. He did not send flowers to Mara's desk because that would have been obvious. Instead he began appearing beside her chair with coffee made exactly the way she liked it. He reserved the quieter conference room when he knew she had a headache. He moved deadlines away from days when he knew she had to accompany her father to physical therapy. He learned, with terrifying speed, that she preferred extra blankets and opened windows, detective novels with terrible endings, and apricot jam she claimed to dislike but always finished. In return, Mara learned that Adrian loosened only one button on his collar even at midnight, that he read reports standing by the window when decisions were difficult, and that beneath all the discipline was a man capable of startling tenderness when no one else was looking. He kissed like he had spent too long imagining it. He listened like every detail she gave him belonged in a vault. He also remained maddeningly formal in the office, which would have been easier to admire if she had not already discovered what that formality dissolved into behind locked doors. The arrangement was temporary by necessity. They had agreed on that. Human resources would need to be informed before anything became visible, and Mara's contract status complicated everything. Adrian wanted the process handled correctly. Mara wanted not to become the subject of whispered pity in a company where women had worked too hard to be reduced to rumor. So they waited. Mostly. Impatiently. The problem with waiting was that other people continued existing. On the 7th day, Mara was called into a private meeting with Harold Pierce, one of the oldest men on the board and one of the few who treated courtesy like a polished weapon. He offered her a seat, folded his hands over a leather folder, and regarded her with the grave concern powerful men often borrowed when they wanted to sound generous while protecting themselves. "You have become very visible very quickly," he said. Mara kept her face neutral. "I am doing my job." "You are doing more than that. People notice where Adrian directs his attention. That can feel flattering for a young employee. It can also become dangerous if lines are misunderstood." "If this is about my performance," Mara said, "would be happy to discuss my results. This is about perception. Adrian is a man of intensity. He values usefulness. People around men like that can misread professional preference as personal significance. I would hate to see you hurt by a confusion of rank." Mara sat straighter. "Then perhaps you should speak to him." Harold smiled thinly. "I am speaking to you because you are easier to protect." By the time she left the room, anger had settled into something sharper. She turned away from her desk and walked to the terrace alcove off the legal corridor, the one place where the building still felt like air. She stood there with both hands on the stone ledge until Adrian's voice sounded behind her. "You disappear whenever something cuts too close." She turned. He was in his jacket, composed, but concern moved under the surface of his face with enough force that she instantly resented how much relief it gave her. "Did someone tell you where I was?" "No. I know where you go when you need air. Harold spoke to me." His jaw set. "I assumed as much." "What did he say?" Mara laughed once without humor. "That your attention can feel flattering. That you value usefulness. That I should not misunderstand my position." Adrian went very still. "He used that word." "Yes. And before you go storming toward the boardroom, that is not actually the worst part." "Then tell me the worst part." She looked straight at him. "The worst part is that I cannot always prove he is wrong." Mara pressed on before courage failed her. "I know what people see. A powerful man. A woman on a temporary contract. Your attention. Your distance. Your control. It makes everything easy to doubt. Even when I do not want to doubt it. Especially then." He stepped closer, not enough to touch. "I asked Legal and Human Resources yesterday to prepare disclosures for a formal relationship." The air left her lungs. "What?" I intended to tell you tonight when I could tell you properly. I wanted process in place first. I wanted certainty before rumor. You cannot build feelings like compliance documents. No, he said quietly. But I can remove every doubt created by me. Wind moved a strand of hair across her cheek. Adrian lifted his hand, then stopped. Mara did not step away. Harold made me feel small, she admitted. His expression changed. Not softer. Sharper with pain. You have never been small anywhere. Least of all to me. She looked down at her hands. That is easy to say here. Then I will say it where people can hear. Her eyes lifted to his. She saw decision there, absolute and already made. That night there was a board dinner at a private restaurant on the river, all dark wood, low light and discreet power. Mara was only supposed to deliver revised briefing packets and confirm seating before leaving. Instead she walked into the reception room and found Harold speaking with two directors near the bar. The conversation thinned the moment she entered. Ms. Ellison, Harold said. Still working late. Admirable. Mara met it calmly. I find the work worthwhile, she replied. That usually helps. One of the directors looked away to hide a smile. Harold's expression cooled. Then Adrian entered. He did not hesitate. He crossed the room directly to Mara, took the packet from her hand, and turned to the directors with the kind of calm that made every person nearby listen. There will be a formal announcement tomorrow regarding Ms. Ellison's appointment to the Executive Strategy Office, he said. Any questions about her role or authority may be directed to me. Silence dropped over the room. Mara stared at him. Appointment. Strategy Office. Permanent. He had solved the professional problem without telling her that part either. Harold recovered first. That seems abrupt. Adrian finally looked at him. Only if you have not been paying attention. No one spoke after that. They did not need to. The message had landed with precision. Mara was not decorative, temporary, or a misunderstanding. She was someone he had chosen to place beside him, publicly and without apology. As voices slowly returned around them, Adrian leaned just close enough for only her to hear. You may be angry with me for the timing, he said, but I would rather risk your anger than let anyone diminish you again. Mara looked at him and understood the exact shape of his devotion. It was methodical, protective, and relentless. You keep doing impossible things in public, she whispered. Only when necessary. And this was necessary. His gaze dropped briefly to her mouth. Completely. She left before the dinner service began because staying another minute would have exposed too much. But in the car ride home, watching the river lights break across the windows, one truth settled quietly into place. Adrian was no longer hiding her, and she was done hiding from what that meant. She wanted the life he had begun making room for, not because he was powerful, but because when the world tried to make her feel small, he answered by giving her more ground to stand on. For her. The official announcement went out at 9 the next morning. Mara Ellison had accepted a permanent role coordinating the Executive Strategy Office. The title was real. Most satisfying of all, the language gave her authority no one could politely explain away. By 10, half the building had emailed congratulations. By noon, the other half had stopped by her desk with newly respectful smiles and questions they now phrased with care. Lynn waited until the hallway cleared, then placed a narrow box on Mara's keyboard. Inside was a silver pen engraved with her initials. From the office, Lynn said. Mara looked up. From him? Lynn's mouth curved. I am choosing professional wording for your benefit. Something inside Mara finally loosened. Harold Pierce did not appear on the executive floor that day. The world outside Halcyon continued at its usual speed, but inside, everything felt newly exact. Mara belonged here because she had earned it. That evening, when the last assistant had gone home and the windows had turned dark with their own reflections, Adrian asked Mara to come into his office. No files waited on the desk. No screen glowed with unfinished business. The room itself seemed to understand that work had finally reached its limit. "Sit," he said. Mara stayed where she was. "That word has become suspicious when you say it." A rare warmth entered his expression. "Then choose your own position." She sat on the sofa by the windows because her knees had become unreliable. Adrian joined her, leaving enough space to count as respectful and not nearly enough to count as safe. "Human Resources approved the disclosure language," he said. "Because you no longer report only through me, there is no policy barrier to us seeing each other, provided you remain free to decline anything without professional consequence. The document is absurdly careful." "That sounds like you wrote it." "I corrected several adjectives." She smiled, then sobered. "Are you asking me something, or briefing me?" "Both." The single word carried no armor at all. Adrian looked at her the way he did when he was about to say something he had rehearsed alone and still did not fully trust to survive daylight. "Most of my life," he said, "I chose caution where other people chose impulse. It built a company. It protected me from expensive mistakes. It also taught me to confuse control with wisdom. Then you arrived and made control feel like a badly fitted suit." Mara drew a slow breath and said nothing, because this belonged to him now. "I do not want secrecy," he continued. "I do not want half measures. I want dinners that are not hidden, arguments that end honestly, mornings when I know whether you slept, evenings when I know you got home safely, and the right to stop pretending that every instinct I have toward you is administrative." Her eyes stung. She hated that he noticed immediately. She loved him more for noticing. "Mara," he said, voice lower now, "I am asking whether you will let this become a life instead of an interruption." For a moment she could not answer. Not because she doubted him. Because she did not. Because the man in front of her had taken every difficult part of himself and laid it down without disguise. So she did the most honest thing available. She leaned forward, took his face in both hands, and kissed him before fear could return. This kiss was not like the first one. It was slower, deeper, chosen without panic. Adrian's hand slid into her hair with a tenderness so careful it nearly broke her heart. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against hers, and both of them were smiling in the quiet like people who had crossed a brutal winter and found spring waiting on the other side. "That sounded like yes," he murmured. It was a highly articulate yes. "Good. I dislike ambiguity. You created most of it." "I know." He kissed her again, brief and warm. "I intend to spend a very long time making up for that." Weeks later, the office had adjusted. Adrian remained demanding. Mara remained sarcastic. Staff learned to absorb the sight of them leaving together after late meetings. Lynn pretended not to notice and noticed everything. Winter gave way to a bright, windy spring. On a Saturday morning in April, Mara stood in her apartment kitchen trying to rescue pancakes from a pan that had already judged her harshly. Adrian, in rolled sleeves and utter skepticism, took the spatula from her hand. "You are losing," he said. "To breakfast?" Decisively. She laughed and leaned against the counter while he turned the next pancake with infuriating competence. On the counter, his phone buzzed unanswered, because for once the empire outside could wait while he chose her first again today. Sunlight filled the small kitchen. Her father, stronger now, was due for lunch. Somewhere outside, the city continued with its old metallic urgency. Inside, everything felt astonishingly simple. Adrian set a plate on the table and looked at her across the rising steam. All the old restraint was still in him, but it no longer stood between them. It lived beside tenderness now, disciplined and real and fully hers to read. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. She narrowed her eyes. "That is never true with you." A slow smile appeared, the one that still felt like seeing a locked room open. I was thinking that you altered every room you entered. Mara crossed to him, slid her arms around his waist, and rested her chin against his chest. And you were terrible at hiding that you noticed. I know. Good, she said softly. I would hate to misunderstand my position. He laughed then, low and unguarded, and kissed her while the pancakes cooled and the morning widened around them, bright as glass, steady as a promise, and warm in every place that had once felt cold.